Welcome to today's Community Cast. My name is Matt Morgan. I'm the pastor at Community Brookside, a new church plant in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We are so blessed by your presence, and we hope that today's content will bring you joy. So I'm going to tell you a story. When Diana Valencia was arrested in Texas on drug charges in September of 2008, there was little doubt regarding her guilt. Anyone caught with 2 kilos of cocaine is definitely going to have difficulty explaining away how that would be an innocent mistake. However, she came up with a novel attempt at getting off. She and her sister decided to bribe the judge who would be hearing her case to make sure that she was able to get off. The plan might have worked since the judge was willing to take the money, except the FBI got involved. Agents had been suspicious of Judge Manuel Barraza, and they cut a deal with Valencia's sister to record her meetings with the judge. She taped a total of 5 conversations with the judge in which they agreed on the price for getting her sister out of prison. Barraza, the judge, was arrested and convicted and lost his judicial position because of his attempts to circumvent justice for profit. And what's even crazier is that just like in Oklahoma, judges are elected to their positions. Barraza ran on a campaign that highlighted his 30-year career as a defense lawyer. So his arrest, his conviction, and his 6-year prison sentence cast doubt on every single case that he assisted in and every single case he adjudicated. And then to top it off, after Barraza's release from prison, even though Judge Barraza was disbarred and could not practice law, he began practicing law. This led him to more federal charges and more financial penalties. So even though he was caught in his sin, even though he had been punished by the law, even though his power and his privilege had been stripped away from him, he still tried to live like none of it even happened. Many people today think that they enjoy their lives and they can sin and find some means of avoiding the circumstances and the consequences of that sin. The sin that entangled Miss Valencia also wrapped up Judge Barraza, and when they tried to avoid prison time, it didn't happen. They both got what was coming to them, what the law required. But if we look at this story as an example, we can see that oftentimes people try to escape consequences when they know they've done wrong. And guys, let me tell you, you cannot escape the consequences forever. When you do something wrong, there are going to be consequences. I've heard people caught in sin, sent to jail, in rehab, how they talk about the situation they've been caught up in. Well, it's not my fault. I didn't do it. Really, it's because of whatever, fill in the blank, right? A lot of times people don't recognize their own faults. They don't want to hear the words of Scripture found in Galatians 6:7 that remind us that we will reap what we sow. As one old preacher says, folks who make those kind of decisions sow wild oats and then they pray for crop failure. We'll talk about that more another time. The sad thing is that the story that I just told you, it's a real life story talking about how corrupt the justice system can be. It's talking about how our world, even though we've set up these checks and balances, sometimes ends up looking really broken, doesn't it? This simple illustration is a microcosm of something that's much greater that we see way more often than we should about how broken our world is. Someone sins and hurts people, then they do whatever they can to get away with their sin, right? They seek any means necessary not to have to deal with the repercussions of something that they've done. People's continual sin causes an intense brokenness in our world. Do we agree with that? And it doesn't have to be somebody who breaks the law in such a dramatic manner that causes our world to be broken. It's the little things sometimes that all of us do that causes the brokenness in our world. And I would bet you money, even though I'm not a betting man, that being caught in sin, being recorded by the FBI, being caught in red-handed happens so little compared to the people who actually get away with their sin for quite some time. That this story is just a little piece of a greater problem in our world. Often we hear stories and we see news articles about how certain celebrities or political or religious leaders think that they can bribe and influence their way out of the repercussions of their sinful actions. These examples are relatively easy to come across, right? We just need to open up Facebook and we can see how this person did this or that religious leader did this. And man, all of us sin. I just want to remind you that all of us sin. And our sin separates us from God's best, God's will for us. And our own brokenness just continues to keep us broken and causes us sometimes to be the cause of somebody else's brokenness too, if we're not careful. And because of our sins and mistakes that we make, multiply that by the 8 billion people around the world, and you can see that our world is dealing with a lot of mistakes. And the world we live in today is not that different from the world that we find Esther in. So remember last week as we walked through kind of the general overview of the book, we saw areas where the world was a wreck for those who were living in it. So this morning, I want us to look at some of the very specifics about what made Esther's world so broken and find ways that we as people of God can act against the brokenness in our world. So if you have a Bible, I'm going to invite you to open up to the book of Esther. We're going to be reading a lot from the book of Esther today, so just hang on to it. Be there. We're going to start with Esther 1, verses 3 and 4. And this is just kind of a microcosm, a small example of the brokenness in Esther's world. You're going to see some examples of pride. You're going to see some examples of greed. You're going to see what's worse is some examples of racism. So let's read this together. And here's what the word says for us today. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. Do you remember where Cush is? Ethiopia. Very good. At the time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed gardens of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. So, we might read this and think, okay, there's a giant party happening, right? And that's not really too uncommon. A lot of times kings with wealth would do that. But you're talking about a party that lasted 180 days. And then when that party was over, he threw a 7-day party, right? So it's party after party in the citadel of Susa because the king, he could just do whatever he wants. So we see little recognizable pieces of our world today in this, don't we? A leader throws a big party to celebrate what he's accomplished. And he does that in order to pat himself on the back. And then when the banquet is over, he throws another 7-day banquet. His pride is evident. He's wanting to show the world what? His what? What does he have? His majesty, right? All of his splendor, all of his majesty is on display for the people of his kingdom. His exuberance is too much. He's squandering the resources of those whom he governs. And it's wasteful. Now, do you recognize some of that in our world today? Have you seen weddings that are like social media extravaganzas, right? With people who spend millions of dollars to get married by renting whatever place and having whatever special designer and having this kind of special food on the menu, right? We see it. There's exuberance, there's extravagance, there's this pride. You need to see who I am. What does pride come before? The fall. Yeah. And we'll see more of that later on. So we recognize in the story of Esther that the king says, everybody is drunk, give them whatever they want. And then at the end of this 7-day banquet, he says, bring in my woman. Wants to parade her around. She's attractive, good-looking lady. I want everybody to see my hot wife, which, understandable, right? And what does Vashti, the queen, what does she say? No. She says, I don't think so. I'm not going to be your trophy wife. Don't parade me around in front of your drunk friends. And that makes the king very angry, right? After his queen doesn't follow the rules by doing exactly what the king wants, when he wants, he gets so mad, he calls together his buddies to advise him what to do next. Hey guys, my wife said no to me and nobody tells me no. What should I do? Let's read this together. It comes from Esther 1, 15 through 20. According to the law, asks the king, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of the provinces of the King Xerxes, right? So because she wasn't willing to show the whole wide world how hot she was, it's sin against everybody. That makes no sense to me. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end to disrespect and discord. Because she said no, now all the other women are going to get sassy and they're going to say no. We don't want that, right? We don't want these women to speak and have a mind of their own. Pfft. Therefore, he goes on, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of the King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. Because, gentlemen, we know that's how to get a woman on your side, right? Just tell her exactly what she should think and do, right? Yeah, wrong. So the world in Esther's time has been set up to devalue women, right? So we have a king who is prideful, he's showing his exuberance, he's wasteful of resources. And we see a society that's set up to devalue women and treat them as subservient to their husbands. There's a sort of domineering patriarchy that pervades all of the empire. And Xerxes believes in it and fully lives into it. He says, hey, Memucan, that's great advice. I think I'll do that. He listens to the advice of his council and then forbids his former queen to ever be in his presence again as long as she shall live. And we know that his rules are so powerful and so potent that they can never be repealed ever. Once he said it, right? You all remember in the Ten Commandments, so let it be written, so let it be done, right? Like that's kind of this same feeling. Write it down, and then it will have to be like that forever. So think about it from Vashti's perspective, a woman who was told she needed to do exactly what she was supposed to do, and then lost her privilege, her power. She was now going to be like a divorced woman in the ancient Near East. As a woman, Vashti most likely would have nowhere else to go or no one else to turn to, unless she happened to have some family that was willing to take her in. And this is an injustice that we see today. In some places in our world, women don't have a voice, right? They can't lead, they can't preach. Sometimes men keep their women at home because the women can't even work. This is a part of our world's brokenness that we have allowed to continue for far too long. And what's more is that in Esther's time, it didn't stop with being devalued. Women were a commodity. Women were bought and sold as objects rather than treated as human beings. And the next part of the story kind of exemplifies this understanding. So we're going to read in Esther 2, verses 1 through 4. It says this, later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, well, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Duh, right? In this part of the story, Xerxes has all of the young women brought from India to Ethiopia. All of the young virgins are brought to him so that he could choose the one he likes the most. Doesn't matter if they want to be removed from their homes or their villages or not. What the king wants, the king gets, right? And there's this sort of human trafficking vibe, isn't there? Where all the young women are taken and presented to the king as a gift. We would never do this today on that kind of grand scale to appease a dictator or a ruler. But there are still places, even in the U.S., where human trafficking can still be found. Here in Tulsa, you're right. This is wrong on every single level imaginable. And as people who believe in a God that liberates and sets us free from our sin through Jesus Christ, we must do every single thing in our power to work to set all people free as well. While this was not really recognized as a problem because of how society functioned in that time, we recognize now that this is a terrible crime against humanity. So I hope that you're really understanding just how broken the world is that Esther lives in. Pride, greed, corruption, human trafficking, devaluing a whole gender of society. So now we have to turn our attention to Haman and how one man's actions impact the lives of other people. So Haman is a guy with an ego. Can we agree with that? We learned a little bit about him last week if you were here. So Haman has an ego. He was a man who was appointed by Xerxes to be basically second in command. It doesn't say that specifically, but he was celebrated, and everywhere he went, the king decreed that people should bow down before Haman. We don't know why. We just know that this is what the king said. Bow down before this man. He's great. And Haman ate that up, right? Haman was given a special honor from the king, and he abused it in every possible way to make sure that people recognized how important he was. And when Mordecai, who is Esther's relative that raised Esther as his own daughter, refused to bow to him, Haman would stop at nothing in order to make sure that Mordecai was punished for his insolence. So let's read Esther 3, 5 through 15. Here's what it says. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and he gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Dun, dun, dun. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people in all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was bewildered. That's pretty weird, right? So like I said last week, Haman bought into his own hype. Haman would rather kill a man, did you hear me, murder a human being, than not be honored in the way he felt he should be honored. Even more than that, he was not content to just kill Mordecai. Now, Mordecai was the one who was literally breaking the law because the king had issued that as a law. He said, I'm not going to stop at Mordecai. I want everybody related to Mordecai, his whole people group, gone off the face of the planet. And the king says, well, I know you've offered me 10,000 talents of silver. Guys, that is a ton of money. It's like $11 billion. King says, nah, keep it. Do whatever you want. Go ahead and rid us of the Jews. Can you imagine? I think you can. Because it happened not that long ago here in our world. So do we see the parallels between Esther's world and our own? A whole people group, let's kill them all. And by golly, it was the same group of people, right? There is so much corruption, so much greed, so much pride and racism that it could not be clearer. The brokenness of the world that they lived in was rife. And without intervention, it would only be made much worse before it could get better. But as we mentioned last week, God was already at work to bring about good in spite of the deep hurt and the evil that was in the world around them. So this morning, let's look and see how Esther and Mordecai dealt with the hurt and the brokenness of the world that they found themselves in. So this is coming from Esther chapter 2, 19 through 23. Here's what the word says for us. It says, when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and they conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and he told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals of the presence of the king. So think about this, right? The moral dilemma that Mordecai is facing here. The Persian king, in whose empire you are literally treated as a second-class citizen, is threatened with assassination. And you, whose people have been routinely persecuted and discriminated against, you decide that you are going to be the voice that keeps the king from a murder plot. That's almost acting against your own self-interest, right? I don't know, maybe for Mordecai and the Jews, it might have been better for Xerxes to be gone. Maybe life would have been easier if King Xerxes was out of the picture. Maybe a different king would have brought a different, situation to the Jewish people. I don't know. But I can guarantee you it was against Mordecai's and the Jews' best interest for him to offer to keep the king alive. Mordecai knew right from wrong, and this plot of murder and betrayal was wrong. It's clear that Mordecai didn't get word to the king to receive recognition for himself or a reward. He told Xerxes about the plot because it was the right thing to do. Mordecai kept his personal feelings out of the way when thinking about the situation. And I believe, as hard as it was, he came up with the right response. We as people are easily swayed, but our call is to do the right thing, even when it may go against our best interest. We are called to be a people of help and wholeness, not retribution against those who we might have felt caused us harm. We're not only called to take care of those we love, but it's clear in the gospel of Jesus that we are also to love our enemies. And that's what Mordecai does in this story. He loved someone he considered was an enemy. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, we read that Jesus told his hearers that they have been taught to live under the law of an eye for an eye, but Jesus warns them that they need to instead offer forgiveness with a radical forgiveness that stops this line of retributive violence. If we live and think and act out of our own desires for what we feel like is justice, we're going to end up causing more problems than we solve. In the book of Esther, we see Mordecai does what's right, even when it was tough. His people were dispersed throughout the empire and forced away from their homeland. They were made to live under the rule of a dictatorial king. They couldn't worship as they were supposed to. They couldn't go to the temple. They couldn't offer sacrifices. They were treated as second-class citizens of the empire, and they were discriminated against. Yet Mordecai still spoke up to save the life of this ruthless king because it was right. There are political leaders, there are church leaders, there are people who do the wrong thing all the time. But our job is to, no matter what they do, to do the right thing. Even when we disagree with them, even when we don't want to look like them, we are to do the right thing. So let's take a look at how Mordecai's advice helps to save his people. When Haman had hatched his plan to destroy all the Jews within the Persian Empire, Mordecai sent word to Esther to speak up for her people, right? This is the part we've heard. This is kind of the highlight of the book of Esther, so let's read it one more time. In Esther 4, 6 through 14. Again, I'm going to mispronounce names. Get ready. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and to explain to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and all the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. There's this back and forth between Esther and her adopted father, this fear-filled conversation between Esther and Mordecai about what to do now that their whole world is facing extinction. Mordecai, knowing that the death of his whole race of people is looming in the very short term, in the near term, tries to convince Esther that no matter what, she has got to act on behalf of her people. And in this moment, Mordecai reminds Esther that her role as queen, her closeness to power, her position and authority were given to her for right now. It's what we talked about last week, that God's providence, his loving concern for his people, has worked to give Esther this powerful voice for just this time when it was needed. God was working for the good of his people the entire time, even though they didn't recognize it, even though they didn't see it. And these words are powerful. And who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? If she was too fearful to act, Mordecai knew that all hope might be lost. Through his tough reminder that she would not go unnoticed as a Jew, Esther knew that she had to act. She faced the same situation as the rest of the Jews did. Although she would die with power and wealth, she would still die. So I want to be clear that while Mordecai is not who this book is named after, I believe that Mordecai his prompting Esther to act was the most important part of this story. The reminder that no matter what, you're going to be stuck in the same situation because you are also one of us. I want you to hear me when I say this. This should be a reminder to us that even though sometimes we don't have power or position or authority or wealth, maybe sometimes we feel inadequate to act, God is calling us to act when we see the wrongs in front of us. Mordecai knew that he could not save the Jews on his own, so he went to the place where he knew he would have an ally, and he asked Esther to act on behalf of all people. Have you ever heard someone say, well, I'm just one person. What can I do? I don't have any power or clout. What can I do? Let this be a lesson to us that sometimes all we have to do when we don't have the power or the authority, we have to use our networks, we have to use our friends, we have to use social media, whatever things that we have to find the right person to act for us. Do you guys know who your senators are? Do you guys know who your city councilors are? Do you guys know who voices of authority and power are in your neighborhoods, at work, in your schools? Even if you don't think you have the voice, you can find someone who does. All of us have friends and networks of people who love us personally. And when we see something wrong in our world, we have to use those people, our relationships, in order to bring justice for those who can't do it for themselves. We have to be willing to find the right people with the right kind of power to make the right kind of difference in our world right now. And that conversation between Mordecai and Esther was exactly what Esther needed to push her into being willing to confront the king, even if it meant risking her own life. So Esther ends up hosting a banquet, right? And she invites the king and Haman to come so that she might ask the king for a favor. So both men come to the banquet, and they're both really excited to be invited there by the queen. And the king says, what do you want? What can I do for you? You can ask for anything you want, even up to half of the kingdom, and it's yours. Right? That's how in love with Esther the king was. Let's read on in Esther 7, 3-6. The queen answered King Xerxes, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request, for I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, so as to not to bug you, your highness, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. And that's crazy to me to think about. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Who is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman who's sitting right next to you. Right, Esther used her power, her voice, her position to call out the injustice that was offered to be done. Let me be clear. Injustice in our world today doesn't often look like genocide, although it can. Injustice might look like an unfair and inequitable education because schools are funded by property taxes, causing some parts of our city to be underfunded based on the value of the homes in the area. Injustice might look like rules put into effect to intentionally keep people from experiencing true equality. Injustice might look like people not being allowed to fully participate in the work of God through their baptism into the priesthood of all believers based on who they love. Injustice might look like discrimination, inequality, corruption, violence, and unjust wars. So while we may not be kings and queens, although I believe you all are, we may not all be wealthy and have lots of resources. God has given us what we have, our gifts and our talents, our abilities, our very lives, that we might be a blessing to others around us. That each of us might use what God has blessed us with to make the world a better place right where we are. And we're going to have to do that by calling out injustice when we see it. Just like in the story of the book of Esther, we have each been given a responsibility to help others and to lift others up through the use of whatever means we have. Our privilege, our power, even if we don't think we have much of it, has to be used to make the world a better place. So Queen Esther could have sat idly by in the safety of her husband's palace and watched the Jews being destroyed. But instead, she risked her own position as queen, her own future, her life, to try to convince the king that her people had a right to exist. And to honor what God wants for the world, we have to be willing to use our voices just like Esther, even when it's scary. So friends, today and always, may each of us be people who are willing to speak against injustice when we recognize it. May we be people who stand on the side of righteousness instead of oppression and seek to bring justice into this broken world. May we be the very people of God who remind one another and help to hold one another accountable to power, so that we can use what we have, the privilege and the gifts that God has given us, to make a difference in the broken world that we live in every single day. May we seek to actively invite others to use their power and their positions to act justly along with us. And friends, may each of us be willing to stop at nothing in order to do the right thing, even if that means acting against what we deem to be our own best interests. May we live out the sacrificial life that God has called us to in the person of Jesus Christ. May this day and always, may we be the people who are willing to give of ourselves in order to be a part of the solution and never a part of the problem of injustice. Thank you so much for joining us on today's Community Cast. We hope that you were blessed by today's conversation. If you'd like to know more about Community Brookside, please feel free to visit us at our website, communitybrookside.com, or find us on your favorite social media outlet. We hope to hear from you soon. Be blessed.